Jay Abraham, a marketing legend, mentor to mentors, and the highest paid marketing consultant in the world.
He's the go-to guy now. And I gotta say, if you think of most of the marketing consultants that you probably don't know the name of, they've all been influenced by Jay.
I probably wouldn't be here without my mentor, Jay Abraham. Through, his teachings and what he's done for me, he's taught me how to position myself in very unique positions, what is my unique offering, as well as the ability to communicate.
Jay Abraham has significantly increased the bottom line of over 10,000 clients and over 400 industries worldwide.
Jay has had a tremendous influence on my business. Not just my business, but really the deep ways in which I think about my students, my readers, my clients, my customers.
His books have profoundly influenced my ability to grow Bulletproof, and his personal mentorship and his one-on-one sessions with me have absolutely changed the game for me and for Bulletproof and for our mission to change the world.
Forbes magazine called him the real thing and lists Jay as one of the top 5 executive coaches in the country. He's also a best-selling author and has been featured in USA Today, the New York Times, Inc., and Success, among many others.
Life is a series of mentors, and Jay Abraham is absolutely the best in that area.
Hello and welcome to this very special edition of Encounters with Jay Abraham. I have today a very, very stimulating guest. He is a specialist in a very, very mission-critical technology, methodology. We'll figure what it is when we talk to him, but it's very powerful for a lot of different reasons, and we'll get into it. But I'm going to stimulate you with a phrase, real agility, real agility. And I'm going to read, I got a note, what it is. Okay, it's delivering more value to your customers and clients faster and with fewer headaches, expenses, and friction. So think about that. I mean, who doesn't want that? Because when you give more value to your clients, they give more money to you. Okay, the gentleman we're going to interview, Mishkin Berteig, is the Canadian, I would call him the preeminent expert on what he calls real agility. And I'm not gonna steal his thunder by explaining what it is. I'm gonna let him demonstrate to you his own intellectual, mental, and expert agility through the course of our interview. But what I think is going to be very, very powerful is the outcome. I'm assuming you're either an entrepreneur, you're a CEO, you're a professional running a private practice, you are a manager, you are responsible for activities, people, and systems and procedures. You have goals, you have budgets, you have initiatives, you have timelines, a lot of moving parts. If any of that resonates, you're going to love the rest of this. And that's the teaser part. Let's get into the meat. Besides being the expert in this, he's also a 2-time author, and he's almost done with his 3rd book, so he'll be soon at 3. One is called Agile Advice. The other I love, I Am Not a Great Leader. We'll get into that. And the new one that is almost ready for publication is called Win as a Manager. Mishkin, how are you?
I am fabulous, and I'm really excited to be talking to you. It's absolutely a huge honor to be here. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
One of the things that people who know me know, and that is that I luxuriate in the presence of people who are masterful at pieces of the puzzle I don't understand, and that describes you. So let's get into it. Why don't we start by explaining what in the world real agility means, what it is, and how it manifests itself in all facets of business and the most applicable facets, okay?
So real agility is essentially the ability of an organization to execute on its strategies and initiatives extremely quickly at extremely high levels of quality and in an extremely responsive way. We all know that the world is filled with complexity and change, and that can often be very disruptive to longer term plans and goals. It's a management technique, it's an execution technique, it's a teamwork technique that helps organizations thrive in complexity instead of struggling with it and being stressed and overburdened by it.
When I first met you and you were trying to lay terms, sort of dumb it down, you said faster, better, easier, cheaper, more successful.
Many processes, many methods also claim the same thing. And in many cases, they do help. The challenge always comes in the distinction between things that are merely complicated versus those that are complex. And the way
describe the difference.
Yeah, the key difference there is that a complicated problem is something where you can analyze it and you can perfectly explain the situation and the solution and execute on it without change. Versus complexity, you might be able to understand the problem, but there's no pre-existing, predetermined solution, and you have to constantly evolve, adapt, innovate, and figure out the solutions as you go with very tight feedback cycles. You can't wait, 3 months or 6 months or a year or even more to figure out whether you're doing the right thing. You have to figure it out in weeks at the most, sometimes as little as a couple of days or sometimes even hours. And so it's that speed of responsiveness that the Real Agility framework brings to an organization.
Okay, so now we have a context of what it is in the very, very macro sense.
Yeah.
So let's talk about where you apply it, how you apply it, and to the extent you can, I'll use a word, I don't know if it exists, concretize the sort of amorphous, let's try to wrap our hands and brain around a little bit more of what it looks like, okay?
The easiest way to do that is to start with what kinds of problems do we solve with Real Agility. And I want to talk about it at 3 levels very quickly. At the highest level, we've already kind of touched on it, which is almost the philosophy of it, right? Like the environment that we all work in, the fact that, people are overburdened and stressed. And that's a problem that Real Agility solves. Just below that level, though, is the specific results. If your projects, for example, are going over budget or over deadlines, if you run a project and at the end you discover that you're not getting the results that you actually need, or that the results aren't, fit for the purpose of your stakeholders or your customers. And even at a more tactical level, if you're discovering that your processes have, frustrating inefficiencies or quality problems in them, all of these things are the kinds of things that Real Agility addresses, but there's a limit, okay? And I want to sort of help narrow it down by saying that what we're talking about is specifically multi-person efforts with knowledge work. So for example,
can you be a little more specific?
Yeah, for example, if you've got a marketing team, or if you've got a software development team, or you've got a research and development team, there's the multi-person aspect, and communication and coordination is often challenging in knowledge work like that. And then the other side of it is, of course, that when you have those kinds of things, you can't guarantee results. You have to do constant experimentation. You have to test things out. And this is why it's about execution. It's not about your strategies. The approach that Real Agility encourages is to experiment with your solutions and get quick feedback so that any mistakes in terms of excellence have much more limited impact, and possibly no impact at all. In fact, they can often be trust building with your customers, with your stakeholders.
I would imagine that gives birth to all kinds of experimental discoveries of winning approaches that are very, very successful for both the customer client and also for the company, doesn't it?
You know, there's this really great little anecdote that one of the gurus in the agile space tells. And, you know, he says that he was talking to the CIO of a large IT organization, so software technology, and the CIO is complaining. He's saying, you know, I run these projects, they're 12 to 18 months long, and at the end, I don't get what I need. And so this guy says back to the CEO, well, you know, with Agile, I can deliver what you don't need in a month. And it's like this huge light bulb. Okay, so actually, we're reducing risk.
I love that. So you're de-risking the whole process.
Exactly, exactly. By implementing these concrete feedback cycles, by trying to actually deliver value on very short time frames. And so that's one of the key principles of real agility, is that you focus on very short-term experiments to deliver value. You know, if your experiment is just to learn, okay, that's fine, but really it's about how do we actually deliver value to our customers, our users, whatever it is, our investors, and do that in a very short time horizon. A week, for example, is very short in a lot of circumstances, or a day.
I would argue there's even one more dimension. You're delivering value to your team that makes them more collaborative and more inclined to want to keep experimenting and trusting the process.
Indeed. In fact, that's actually one of the main principles of real agility. And it's a very simple principle that you want, you know, high degrees of teamwork and cohesion. And this phrase that's used, which is self-organization, that team members are so engaged, so responsive, so committed to the overall goals that they figure out, as if they're owners of the whole thing, what needs to be done. They have no limits in terms of their thinking. They're not, you know, narrowly defined roles that constrain their thinking or behavior. Instead, they're all looking towards the overall goal, participating in the rapid feedback loops, de-risking, and delivering value in whatever way they possibly can. You know, knowledge workers are smart people. You take your random software developer, your random marketing person, your random design person, they're all really smart people. And the ironic thing is that by limiting their roles, most organizations actually disempower their people, their knowledge workers, from really truly contributing at the level that they can.
I'm thinking about something that, and I think it's Tony Robbins, and if it's not original, he says it a lot one way or the other. The greatest resource is the ability to really develop your resourcefulness. And that is, and the fluidity, the ability to see that your roles can be much more expansive. In a normal organization, they'll say, well, this is my role and I don't do anything else. And what people don't realize is by compartmentalizing, and I'm just assuming this, you can validate or invalidate, it constrains the optimal outcome and performance of the whole team, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I love that phrase about resourcefulness. What you're doing. So if you apply these techniques as a leader, as a manager, as an owner of a business, then what you're doing is you're unlocking the inherent resourcefulness of your people and their ability to solve problems on behalf of customers and the business. It's really quite a thrilling kind of environment to work in. You know, a lot of these knowledge workers are actually really disappointed and discouraged by the corporate environments that they find themselves in. And this just unlocks a huge, tremendous amount of resourcefulness and enthusiasm in the people.
And one of the things that I think, and I can't remember the research I saw, but it was really dramatic and shocking that while most organizations are focused, how can we get our marketing better? How can we get our assets to perform better? How can we get our capital deployed better. They don't realize that probably the biggest underperforming asset resource investment they have is human capital. And if you're getting, let's call it, which I think the numbers were something like 22% performance capability out of people, you're not going to get to 100. But if you could get 22 to 32, what would that mean in yield, in output, in quality performance, in innovation, creativity? I mean, breakthroughs, it would be profound, wouldn't it?
And those numbers that you threw out there are pretty close to what we find when we do assessments in organizations.
Tell us about the assessment. What do you assess?
So it's really astonishing how incredibly inefficient most organizations are. There's huge amount of waste from quality problems, from coordination overhead, from delays, and most of this is, I would say, simple to fix, in the sense that the principles and the techniques are easy. There's challenges, certainly, but when we do these assessments, we look at culture, we look at performance, we look at an organization's KPIs, and whatever data they have to basically say, you're at a certain level. And it's kind of like, I have to admit that when we've done this, sometimes people don't believe our results because they're so bad.
Give us some examples. This is taken off the gloves. This is like no nonsense. We're talking to people whose job responsibility or life responsibility, if they own the business or a lot of the stock in the business, is to produce competitive advantage, marketing, selling, developmental superiority. So take off the gloves. Talk about the truth.
A lot of organizations are at about 10% efficiency for their knowledge work. So
wow.
What does that mean? It means that 90% of their money is going towards wasteful, non-value added activities or opportunity cost inefficiencies or rework problems. I mean, there's so many sources of waste. For example, we worked with a small insurance company here in Canada a number of years ago, and that's exactly it. It was 90% waste, 10% efficient, effective, value-added work. And when you start that bad, actually getting noticeable, significant, measurable improvements isn't that hard. That's the incredible thing. And so, very, very quickly, we brought them up to about 40% efficiency.
So 400% increase, but I'll bet anything it's not linear. It's probably almost asymmetric, isn't it?
So they had, one of the cool things is that they had a benchmark project that they would do. Very simple thing. They would change the price on a term life insurance policy. So, like the kind of thing you buy a 10-year policy, what's the price for that? And before we started working with them, it took them 6 months end to end from the decision to make the price change to the point where it was actually rolled out into the marketplace. Now, 6 months, depends on the marketplace. Maybe that doesn't seem too bad, but unfortunately, for their marketplace, it was causing them problems. Their competitors were a little bit faster than them, and so they were always following the market rather than leading it. And so we worked with them for 6 months. We continued to support them for another year after that. Now, in the context of what we did, after 6 months, they had taken that benchmark project and reduced it from 6 months to 6 weeks. Okay. Then in the year follow-up support, they took that even further and reduced that 6 weeks down to 2 weeks. Again, this is not unusual for what we find. There's something really incredible here. There's a phrase also comes from the Agile community. I didn't make this one up, that applies to a lot of these situations. The phrase is, stop starting, start finishing. And it's this really profound, but difficult thing to do, which is to say, basically, the more stuff you take on, the longer everything takes to implement. And that's exponential too, right? Like you were talking about exponential improvement. Well, it's also exponential inefficiency. If you work on one thing at a time, you're at usually pretty close to maximum productivity. If you're working on two things at a time, it's not 50% productivity for both. It's more like 40% productivity for both and 20% task switching waste. And then you add a third thing and a fourth thing and a fifth thing, and before long, you're at 90% waste and 10% productivity in total.
One of the things that I'm obsessed with, and we're actually writing a book with somebody very prominent that's taking hedge fund theory and applying it to life and business. And it's basically about trying to basically get asymmetric upside, but de-risking the downside. And most people think there's no way to, but you really can. You've figured out how to compress, test, validate, adjust, right?
Exactly.
Abandon or adjust, depending on which. So give us a couple more case studies, because I have had the privilege of spending quality time with you and your wife, who's involved in the business. I have been able to understand it. I won't do it justice, but when you tell me the case studies, they come alive. And most people need case studies or metaphors to wrap, their heads around how it would directly apply to them. And also, if you can, you gave us one really great example of going from 10 months to 10 weeks or 10 days or whatever the example was. Pardon me about that. I'm ADD and I'm trying to stay on a forward focus. But if you give us some more examples that span a bit of an arc or a gamut, and try to hone in on the measurable impact, because I want people to recognize the profound implication tangibly in as many denominators: financial, timeline, time to market, competitive advantage, reduction of team, reduction of attrition of high value knowledge workers, any and all of those. And you have those stories. So I'm just trying to set you up to help people grasp the magnitude.
Yeah. So one of my absolute favorite experiences was working on the mine site for Suncor Energy up in northern Alberta, where they have oil sands mining. And going up there, I didn't know for sure what to expect, but we had been engaged by the superintendent of mining projects, a guy named Darren Zandy. And Darren had become very passionate about teamwork. And he recognized that within his team of project and shift supervisors, he had some serious teamwork problems.
Okay.
So we went up there, and it's like these incredible huge dump trucks and tractors, and like blasting limestone with dynamite, and like all this stuff that I had never directly experienced before in my life. And the basic problem was that they were wasting huge amounts of mining uptime, because they were responsible for maintaining the mine site, that it was flowing, operating specifically efficiently, that the oil sands were being collected and put into the extraction processing system. And that when his team had problems, it would often mean that the mine site was down for a day or two, which would mean literally hundreds of millions or sometimes billions of dollars of lost revenue. It's just massive amounts of money resting on his team's shoulders when they screwed up, which happened way too much. So he brought us in to help with teamwork, to help with processes, to help with all the things that we include in real agility, to help him execute more effectively and essentially reduce the downtime that his team was having. A really simple example of this, they worked on these 12-hour shifts, And so when there was a shift change, the shift supervisor for the current shift would have to, communicate effectively with the shift supervisor for the next shift. And they would often turn, like, it would be yelling and, all sorts of mistakes being made. They'd have downtime for their equipment. Or another problem was when there was a weather event. If it snowed, for example, it would shut down the mine site until they could get the safety protocols implemented, which often took a day and a half, sometimes even longer. So we help them learn to self-organize, to work more effectively as a team. Some of that's just basic communication skills, honestly. Like, there wasn't a lot of magic there. But they hadn't been trained in it. They didn't know how to apply it. We also train them on how to implement continuous improvement and learning for the processes that they had. And a big piece of that was making the work visible. And
what does that mean?
Yeah, so think about knowledge work, planning, problem solving. It's all in people's heads, right? And so how do you know if someone's actually working if it's in their heads?
Oh, what a great question. How do you know?
Well, you have to make the work visible. You have to make thought visible. And the way you do that is usually with some kind of simple visual task tracking system that's ideally physically in the work environment. Like a whiteboard with stickies on it, for example, can be really simple. But there's a discipline around doing that. It's so easy when it's in your head. And by the way, you and I both have that ADHD thing. So we know that sometimes we forget the disciplines and we need assistance with that, right? So we make the thought visible. We get people to check in on a regular basis and make their thought visible by putting it on a board in some form, stickies, notes, whatever it happens to be. And of course, we help with creating those boards so that they're efficient and effective for the particular circumstances. And then by making thought visible, you don't forget stuff, or what someone else has been doing. For example, one of the things that they had to do is they had to, when there was a weather event like snowfall, they would have to clean the roads on the mine site so that these huge 400-ton dump trucks didn't fall into the ditch and get stuck there for hours or days, right? So how do you know who's cleaning the roads when you're not actually on the mine site? Well, one of the shift supervisors would have to write a little sticky that says, this unit and this unit and this unit, these tractors or whatever are actually cleaning in progress going on right now. And why was that important? Because if the shift changed and the other person didn't know, they might reallocate the same resources or different resources and cause waste. Or they might take those existing people who are in progress and reassign them somewhere else, not knowing that they were doing something critical. If thought isn't visible, those are the kinds of mistakes that happen. Interruptions, reallocations, or rework. So, long story short, over the course of 6 months, we helped them make huge efficiency improvements. In terms of their own budgets, they saved about $10 million a year on their budget for the cost of doing their work. And although we didn't have a precise measurement, it was many billions of dollars in recovered or not lost revenue for the mining work itself. Now, that's not the thing that really impressed me, though, because at that 6-month point, we did a bit of a review with the team that we were working with, this management team. And as we were going into the office where we were going to do this review, one of the managers, who at the start of the program had been among the most resistant, most taciturn, most hesitant, most, like, you guys are total idiots, you get out of here, and with a lot stronger language, by the way. He pulled me aside And he said, kind of like almost shyly, you know, I've been working here for 30 years. And for that whole 30 years, I've hated my job. Literally, I'm about to retire. And I was looking forward to it until you guys came. Because for the first time in 30 years, I love my job. It was mind-blowing, right?
I love that.
What a transformation. And this is what we see over and over and over in organizations that we work with. People are so overwhelmed. They're in such negative environments. And often they might love the work, but hate their job, right? Like they might be committed professionals who are doing the best they possibly can, but they're struggling under a huge emotional burden of frustration and anger and overwhelm and despair because their work systems suck. They're overwhelmed by executive demands, which are often very legitimate, but then they have these things that happen to them, like the bureaucracy, for example, that's frustrating, or the seeming limitations of their team that make it so that they're stuck between these forces. And when we can help them align those things, resolve those things, alleviate those things, suddenly it's like, you know, the bright sunshine coming out from the darkest clouds. It's really amazing.
No, I love that. I love that. I wrote something and I'm so embarrassed because I want you to talk about it, but I have double carpal tunnel and the worst penmanship. And when I'm in a hurry, I can't read it. But you said something to me right before this about a really cool thing you wanted to talk about was execution, not strategic. And I can't read the last word. What's the last word?
It might have been strategic planning or initiatives, probably initiatives.
Looks like a C, but maybe it is initiatives. Is there one more word? It could be, but why don't you talk about whatever, because I can't read my handwriting, but it was really stimulating to me. And I wanted to make sure before we stop that we address that. And I want to address one more thing, which I think you will agree, that the concept of multitasking is a fallacy. It doesn't really exist, does it?
Yeah, it's a total.
So why don't you address those two things before we stop? And then I want to talk about some of your new offerings because they're fascinating to me and I want to get into them real quickly. But let's talk about those two things. Execution, not strategic, blank, and the fallacy of trying yourself or anybody else to multitask and how high priority or high value activities get included in low value, and it takes much longer, gets marginalized, and costs you a lot financially, if you believe that.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So regarding execution and strategy. So one of the things that we are very careful about in our services is that we are not strategic management consultants. We don't help you decide what the right thing to do is for your customers, for your investors, or anything like that. We're not about strategy. Rather, what we're about is helping you with the biggest obstacle, namely execution. And that when you make great strategic decisions, if you have poor execution, it doesn't matter. You can have the best decisions possible, and if you can't execute, it doesn't matter. And you know, as I was saying earlier, when you're talking about knowledge work, traditional approaches to planning and executing just don't work. So you need a new system for execution, this real agility system. So when you have your executives working together, or your owners or your leaders or your board of directors or what have you, the value that we offer them is to recreate their organization in a way that they can be absolutely certain that the execution they get is absolutely top notch, because it's not just following a plan, it's responding to change. And that's something that so many organizations struggle with. It's embracing change. It's thriving with change. And So this actually connects with the second thing you asked me about, which is task switching. Because what often happens in an organization, and this is something that, by the way, I'm somewhat guilty of myself, is that the executive leaders will tell their teams, let's do this, this, and this, top 3 priorities, right? And then a week later or a month later, they'll say, wow, you know, we're in the marketplace, we're looking at things, we also need this and this, 2 more things. And then a few days later, you know, a client will request something and they'll say, and add this. And you start to get this pile of work. And the teams just assume they have to work on everything, and that they have to work on it simultaneously, and that they have to somehow juggle, you know, literally dozens of initiatives at the same time, which leads to the multitasking problem. So in multitasking research, of which there is tons, multitasking, as you said, no one really does multitasking. What they do is they switch between different tasks and do them one at a time, but there's a cost to that switch. And when you're talking about knowledge work, that cost is actually much higher than when it's other types of more rote or mechanical or systematic work, right? Like if you have a formula for how you do your work, switching between doing that formula on this thing versus doing that formula on this thing is often not too hard. But when it's knowledge work that takes creativity, context, evolution, the mental time and effort to make that switch is really substantial. And it also creates an emotional burden on people too. So then you're doing this task switching. There's a lot of overhead that comes from just task switching as an individual, as a team, as a manager. And when you burden people with all these different things, people start to forget what are the priorities, and they start to focus on what's easy instead of what's important. It's, again, it's this subtle psychological thing that happens, but when you're overburdened with work, what do you tend to want to do? Not everyone, but most people tend to just say, well, what's the easiest thing I can do right now? Okay, I'm going to do that, when it might be the least valuable thing they could possibly focus on. And so this overburdening of people, again, is one of these things that leaders often do accidentally. They have lots of great ideas and they overburden their people and they get poor results because of task switching overhead and the bias to work on the easy stuff instead of the valuable stuff.
We're in the last vestiges of this interview, and I want to talk about some of the interesting and invaluable services and products that you offer. You have coaching, you have training, you have seminars, but you have 2 really interesting offerings that I think any manager should be at least apprised of because they're very valuable. So let's talk about Win as a Manager. That's a program. And let's talk about Real Agility Management Track. So I've given you 2 tracks to talk about.
Okay, so the Win as the Manager seminar is really my favorite thing I'm doing right now. It is so fun, so insightful, so valuable for the people who come to it. And it's really targeted at those managers who are feeling that stress, who are feeling that overwhelm from all these demands and changes and all that stuff that's going on. You know, if you're managing, and by the way, you could be an owner managing people below you, you could be in a mid-size organization somewhere in the middle. Anyone who's managing people is often in this position of stress. And if that stress is just building and building and building and building and building and pushing you up against your limits, then this 3-hour seminar is designed to help you deeply understand the sources of those stress and give you some very, very practical, down-to-earth tips, practices, techniques that will help you reverse the trend, get that stress level down, particularly by helping you increase the capacity and effectiveness of your team. And so, you know, there's some mindset stuff in there to help you. There's like, honestly, there's a lot of great stuff in that 3 hours packed in there, including some extra resources. But the key of it is, what are some quick wins that you can apply as a manager to increase the capacity of your team, to release some of that capacity for reducing your stress?
And also, it's a really nice, immersive, quick, compressed way to get some really inspiring understanding of your work.
Yeah, absolutely. So we give an overview of the framework of real agility in more depth than you and I have done here. We you know, isolate those key pieces. And what's really important about our seminars is there's always a practical component where our participants are guided through some exercises. They actually do a little bit of work in the seminar to apply what we're teaching. We never want to leave a person coming out at the end saying, oh, that was great theory, now what do I do, right? So at a couple of different points throughout the 3 hours, we get people to do very, very simple but powerful exercises on how to apply what we're talking to their real environment. And we give them the support to say, yeah, that's right, that works, that makes sense, or hey, why don't you adjust it a little bit? So there's a little bit of consulting coaching built into the seminar as well. So that's Win as a Manager. And by the way, that's the one that I'm going to be converting into a book. That's
okay. I love that.
Yeah.
And we've talked about it, and it's a compelling concept. What's the bigger real agility management track?
That builds on Win as a Manager. This is for people who really want a higher level support, a peer group to work with, hand-holding and coaching, and who want to go much, much, much deeper into the specific topic of creating high-performance teams. You know, the participants typically are people who have a group underneath them that needs to deliver something, a project, or, you know, whatever it happens to be, and they feel it in their bones. Yes, there's more capacity here. I just don't know how to unlock it, you know, to that full extent. We cover all sorts of things in terms of how do you create the right mindset in your staff? How do you shift their thinking away from, you know, more traditional approaches to managing their work to these new approaches that include self-organizing and fast feedback and, you know, making the work visible. And the ultimate outcome of that program is that an individual who goes through that program should be able to easily double the productivity of their team. Usually it's more, but that's kind of like the benchmark for what people.
Pretty amazing. That's pretty incredible. Wow, I love it. All right, we are out of time, but you basically bedazzled me, and I hope you stimulated and favorably provoked every viewer and listener to really reevaluate their thinking on collaboration, on knowledge workers, whether it be marketing, whether it be programmers, really anything that is focused on a really high yield agenda, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, very good. So now we know you possess knowledge that we don't, and many of us want to learn it and apply it so that we can be more competitive. And to circle back, okay, how are we going to deliver more value to your customers, clients, faster, easier, better, more profitably for you, more advantageous for them, more successful for everyone, with fewer headaches, friction, and constraints? So how does somebody find you, reach you, communicate with you, access all your services and program, get your personal access? What do they do?
I'm the only Mishkin Berteig in the world that I know of, so it's easy to find me on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect and message me there. But of course, we have a website, berteig.com. That's spelled Berteig. Win as a Manager and the Real Agility Management track are both easily accessible on Berteig.com.
Good. And you are a very impressive person. And I love, as I said in the beginning, people who have pieces of the puzzle that really explode performance. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this.
Jay, thank you. I really appreciate it. And I'm honored to be interviewed by you. Thank you.